The War of Words, Jacques Derrida, John Searle, and the Meaning of Meaning, a dramatized version. The battered wooden doors of the old lecture hall creaked open, revealing a cavernous space teeming with scholars, students, and curious onlookers. It was a late autumn afternoon in the early 1980s at the University of Chicago, a place storied for its intellectual rigor. Outside, leaves had begun to swirl along the sidewalks, painting everything in warm hues of gold and auburn. Inside, the air crackled with anticipation. Two intellectual titans, Jacques Derrida and John Searle, were about to meet in person for what was promised to be a spirited debate about language, meaning, and the very possibility of truth in communication. Over the preceding decade, their writings had clashed across continents, leaving in their wake a line of demarcation where philosophical camps aligned themselves on one side or the other. Students jostled to find seating. Professors conferred quietly, remarking on the controversies of the day. A faint hum of excitement rippled across the auditorium. At the front stood a long table with two microphones, flanked by the imposing oak podium, where someone would soon introduce the two scholars. A large chalkboard spanned the back of the stage, with chalksticks neatly lined up in the tray, awaiting use. Rows of overhead lights glinted above, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. As the hall filled to capacity, a hush fell among the throng. Stepping in from opposite entrances, one from the left of the stage, the other from the right, came Jacques Derrida and John Searle. Derrida, the Frenchman from the École Normale Supérieure, wore a dark suit and a characteristic half-smile, his hair dishevelled in a way that seemed intentional. He carried a slim sheaf of papers, perhaps notes or last-minute references. Searle, the American analytic philosopher from UC Berkeley, wore a tweed jacket with leather elbows and carried a book brimming with marked pages. While Derrida seemed more relaxed, taking in the crowd with gentle curiosity, Searle possessed the stony expression of a seasoned analytic philosopher who had weathered many intellectual duels. A man in a charcoal grey suit, presumably the session's moderator, strode to the podium and cleared his throat into the microphone. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," he began. "We are here to witness a remarkable meeting of minds. John Searle, a leading figure in the philosophy of language and mind, well known for his work on speech acts and intentionality, and Jacques Derrida, the founder of the critical philosophy known as Deconstruction. Over the past years, their exchange in scholarly journals and books has provoked a profound dispute over the nature of meaning, interpretation, and truth. Today, we will attempt to find common ground or confirm the impossibility thereof through reasoned debate." A flicker of amusement danced across Derrida's face. Searle, for his part, appeared slightly impatient, as though eager to slice through the rhetorical flourish and begin dissecting arguments. After the introductions, they took their seats at the table, each glancing at the other, with a mixture of respect and intellectual wariness. Thus began an afternoon that would reverberate through the corridors of philosophy for decades to come. Setting the stage, backgrounds and beginnings. When Jacques Derrida was a young student at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, he was taken by the structuralists, and soon after he questioned and dismantled their entire framework. He revealed the hidden assumptions in texts, exposing how language never fully arrives at a definitive meaning. In Of Grammatology, published in 1967, Derrida laid out the fundamental premise that there is no fixed center to language. Instead, words acquire meaning only through infinite chains of other words, a concept encapsulated in his signature term, difference, which indicates both the act of differing and deferring meaning. As he continued to develop his thought, the notion of deconstruction took shape, the task of reading texts against their grain, exposing internal contradictions, and unraveling the presence of unspoken hierarchies. On the other side of the Atlantic, John Searle established himself within the analytic tradition. His work on speech act theory, building upon J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words, gave him a prominent platform. Austin's premise was that certain utterances, "I promise," "I apologize," "I declare," are performative acts that do not merely describe, but also enact changes in reality. Searle systematized and expanded these ideas, detailing the conventions, intentions, and social frameworks in which speech acts function. For him, language was a rule-governed system, comprehensible through logical analysis. Clarity, rigor, and systematic explanation were paramount. Initially, neither Derrida nor Searle seemed to pay much attention to the other. Derrida's circle, sometimes called post-structuralist or simply continental, had its own set of references: Heidegger, Husserl, Nietzsche, Saussure, and others. Searle's circle, part of the Anglo-American analytic tradition, focused on Russell, Wittgenstein, Frege, and Austin, among others. The two traditions rarely intermingled, each harboring a certain skepticism or outright dismissal of the other's methods. That changed when Derrida wrote an essay titled Signature, Event, Context, in which he took on Austin's speech act theory, pointing out potential aporias or paradoxes. Searle soon fired back in Reiterating the Differences, a reply to Derrida. The differences were indeed reiterated, as the two philosophers found themselves engaged in a charged intellectual confrontation. Their debate revolved around crucial questions. Is meaning determinate or indeterminate? Can we rely on context to fix a stable meaning, or is context itself subject to endless interpretive spirals? For Derrida, textual meaning unravels through the interplay of difference. For Searle, meaning is publicly accessible, grounded in conventions and intentions, providing enough determinacy for effective communication. Now, having exchanged pages of theoretical arguments, they found themselves face to face. Neither seemed entirely sure how far this confrontation would go, nor the extent to which the other's philosophical stance might shift. 2. The debate begins. We are here to clarify meaning. The moderator, an esteemed professor of comparative literature, introduced the first question. Professor Derrida, could you begin by summarizing your position on the nature of textual meaning and how it challenges traditional analytic conceptions of language? Derrida leaned forward, folding his hands. I would not say I challenge in the sense of outright negation, he began, his French accent coloring his words, but rather I question the underlying assumptions. That meaning is fully present, that there is some central locus of truth in language. In my work, particularly in texts such as of grammatology and signature event context, I have tried to show that the so-called presence of meaning is continuously deferred. Language operates through a system of differences, and every concept, every word, only acquires meaning in relation to other words and concepts. This concept of difference, which I spell with un, posits that meaning is never truly self-identical, but always entangled in an unending interplay of references. He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. Then, with a gracious nod towards Searle, he continued, Where my friend Professor Searle and I differ is, I believe, in the assumption that the conventions of language and the intentions of a speaker can anchor meaning in any final or fixed way. I argue that context is never a stable foundation, because context itself can be recontextualized, repeated, or transformed. Searle cleared his throat, and the moderator turned to him. Professor Searle, the moderator said, perhaps you wish to respond. Searle shifted in his seat. Certainly. I take Derrida's point that context can shift. That's hardly a revelation. Language does change, context can be redefined. But that observation doesn't invalidate the possibility that certain meanings are sufficiently fixed for communication to occur successfully. My position is based on the premise that we use language with intentions, within established social rules. These rules allow us to understand each other to a workable degree. Of course, there is room for ambiguity or misunderstanding, but it doesn't follow that meaning is infinitely deferred. If that were the case, we'd never actually communicate anything. We'd be lost in a labyrinth of indefinite signifiers. He smiled briefly, glancing at Derrida. Jacques, if you truly believed in the endless indeterminacy of meaning, you wouldn't have bothered writing anything at all, because you'd assume no one could understand your words. Yet here we are, presumably understanding one another. Some in the audience chuckled softly, others nodded in agreement or frowned in dissent. Derrida, unruffled, merely gave a slight tilt of the head in acknowledgement, his smile a mystery. 3. Flashbacks of letters, journals, and scholarly exchanges. As the debate in Chicago continued, both philosophers found themselves reflecting on the events that had led them to this moment. In Derrida's mind, the year 1972 still loomed large. He remembered writing his essay, Signature, Event, Context, in the hushed library of his Parisian apartment. There, amidst the warren of bookshelves and scattered notes, he had pored over Austin's work, intrigued by the premise that utterances can be performative. But even as he found the idea compelling, he saw what he believed to be a blind spot: Austin's assumption that the context of an utterance was stable enough to fix meaning. For Derrida, the possibility of iterability, the idea that any utterance can be repeated in contexts far beyond the speaker's original intentions, undermined Austin's assurance of stable meaning. When that essay reached the desks of American philosophers, it caused an uproar. Many in the analytic tradition felt that Derrida had misread or insufficiently understood Austin. John Searle, in particular, took up the charge to refute Derrida's claims in an essay ironically titled Reiterating the Differences, a reply to Derrida. Searle insisted that Derrida's remarks misunderstood Austin's central points, that performative utterances rely on well-defined social and linguistic conventions to generate their effects. The concept of iterability, while real, did not imply a radical indeterminacy of meaning. Rather, it was precisely through such repeatability of conventions that speech acts could be recognized and interpreted. Derrida's counter-reply limited ink, scathingly dissected Searle's arguments, accusing him of overlooking or oversimplifying the philosophical stakes involved. This exchange took on mythic proportions within academic circles, presenting a microcosm of the broader continental versus analytic divide. Now, years later, they sat under the same roof, rehashing the same concerns before an audience that had devoured their writings. 4. Interlude: The Students' Perspectives. In the rows near the back of the hall, a group of graduate students whispered animatedly as Derrida and Searle traded retorts. Among them was Marie, a French literature student enthralled by Derrida's work on deconstruction, particularly his reading of Rousseau and the concept of writing as archi-écriture, a foundation that undermines the primacy of speech. Next to Marie was Ben, an analytic philosophy student from California, whose admiration for Searle's clarity of argument was unwavering. They represented the two opposing intellectual lineages converging in that grand room. "He's absolutely right," Marie murmured, gesturing toward Derrida. "Language is always destabilized, especially when it comes to literary texts. We read a poem by Baudelaire or Mallarmé, and each time the text evolves, reveals new shades of meaning. We can't pin it down to a single interpretation." Ben frowned, adjusting his glasses. But that's literature, which often thrives on ambiguity. Philosophical discourse aims for clarity and precision. Searle's point is that ordinary language has rules that enable communication. If every utterance were as unstable as a poem, society couldn't function. We'd never accomplish practical tasks. Marie, undeterred, countered, "But Derrida's not denying that we can accomplish tasks. He's showing that language is never pure, never fully guaranteed. There's always a remainder, unspoken assumptions, subtle biases, political implications. Deconstruction reveals these hidden layers." Ben's eyebrows rose. "But is it hidden layers or endless guesswork? I respect Derrida, but there has to be a limit to how far we can deconstruct before we lose the text entirely." They turned their attention back to the stage as Derrida began to speak again, compelling them into a hushed silence. 5. Enter the philosophical crossfire. On stage, the tension mounted. Searle leaned forward, arms crossed, as Derrida tried to clarify the intricacies of deconstruction. "When I read a text, philosophical, literary or otherwise, I ask questions about the hierarchy of values embedded in it. For instance, the presumption that speech is more authentic than writing, or that presence is more original than absence. Deconstruction is about revealing these oppositions and showing that the privileged term depends on the supposedly subordinate term. This undermines the idea of a stable origin or a final meaning." Searle responded, his tone measured. "I appreciate that you want to point out hidden assumptions, but I wonder if your approach might conflate legitimate ambiguities with a universal claim that meaning can never be pinned down. The entire basis of speech act theory is that words can be used to perform actions precisely because we share an understanding of their meaning. When I say, "I promise to pay you $5 tomorrow," there is a recognized conventional force to that utterance. You might say that context can shift, but it's not indefinitely malleable. You and I can understand when the promise is serious, ironic, or made under duress. Derrida's eyes flickered. And what if you repeated that promise in a theatrical play, quoting lines given by a playwright, or in a sarcastic manner meant to subvert the usual understanding of a promise? We then see that the mark of a statement is not bound by the speaker's intention, nor by a single context, but it circulates among various contexts. The same "I promise" can appear in countless scenarios, each time acquiring new resonances, new values, new interpretive layers. Searle's tone turned slightly exasperated. But that's my point. We can recognize sarcasm, theatrical performance, or sincerity precisely because we share certain conventions about how language is used. If meaning were infinitely deferred, we wouldn't be able to detect the difference between a genuine promise and a theatrical one. The very fact that we can identify these contexts suggests that meaning is not purely indeterminate. A ripple of applause moved through part of the audience while others sat in thoughtful silence. The moderators appeared satisfied with the robust exchange, yet they urged the conversation to continue, hoping to find some deeper resolution or at least an illuminating contrast between their views. 6. A glimpse into Derrida's past. As the debate wore on, Derrida found his mind wandering back to his earliest influences, texts by Husserl, Heidegger, and especially Nietzsche. He remembered spending hours poring over Nietzsche's aphorisms, intrigued by the way they defied a single, stable interpretation. He also recalled the moment he first read Saussure, with that bold claim that in language there are only differences without positive terms. For Derrida, these ideas were like cracks in the foundations of Western metaphysics, revealing that meaning was not something one could capture once and for all, but rather something that emerged through a play of differences. He had once been enthralled by the idea that philosophical texts had hidden biases: logocentrism, the tendency to privilege speech over writing, presence over absence, identity over difference. This realization filled him with an almost mischievous delight. By deconstructing major works of philosophy, he could rewrite the rules of engagement, showing how even the loftiest arguments were compromised by their reliance on these unstated hierarchies. In that moment, gazing across the table at Searle, Derrida felt a deep sense of intellectual sympathy mixed with profound disagreement. He did not see Searle as an enemy, but as a formidable interlocutor who exemplified the clarity and rigor of the analytic tradition. It was precisely that clarity Derrida believed needed to be deconstructed, for it concealed complexities that, once unveiled, would broaden our understanding of language. 7. Searles Reflections, the analytical foundation. For John Searle, clarity was paramount. He had come of age in an era when philosophy in the English-speaking world was consumed by logical positivism, only to transition into ordinary language philosophy. Russell, Wittgenstein, Ryle, and Austin had each in their way insisted that philosophy be brought down to earth, to the words we use every day. Searle admired Derrida's erudition, but he also saw in deconstruction a kind of playful trickery, a refusal to be pinned down, a penchant for rhetorical flourish that risked confusing rather than clarifying. Searle's own worldview was one in which meaning was anchored in collective intentionality. He believed that people could form institutions, like money, marriage, and government, by collectively agreeing on what words and actions signify. The fact that language is repeatable did not, in his mind, threaten its stability. Instead, it showed how language's repetition was embedded within conventions. The puzzle of meaning, for Searle, rested on how individuals used those conventions to communicate intentions, how social facts came into existence through the performative utterances of language. Yet now, in that grand lecture hall, Searle felt a tinge of curiosity. Was there something in Derrida's stance that he had overlooked, something about how every meaning can unravel, opening the door to reinterpretation? Searle knew intellectually that contexts shift. He had studied metaphor, fiction, speech in different cultures. but he believed, at the end of the day, that there was something robust enough in language to preserve a sense of determinacy. Otherwise, how could philosophers even debate in the first place? 8. A surprise question. Midway through the debate, an unexpected question came from one of the audience members, a fellow philosopher who specialized in literary theory. Professor Searle, if deconstruction does not entirely negate the possibility of meaning but rather complicates it, might there be a fruitful middle ground? Could we say that language is stable enough for ordinary communication, but in certain contexts, literary, philosophical, its inherent instability is more fully activated? Searle pondered for a moment. I wouldn't deny that literary texts invite multiple interpretations. My point is that these multiple interpretations aren't due to some intrinsic instability of language per se, but rather to the complexities of human creativity. It's not that words inherently cannot mean anything. It's that authors might deliberately introduce ambiguities. So yes, we could say that in some contexts, you get more interpretative leeway than in others. Derrida leaned in. But why call it leeway as though it were an optional extension, something that can be tacked on or taken away? My argument is that even the most straightforward statement, "I promise to pay you $5, is haunted by the possibility of recontextualization. Yes, for pragmatic purposes we treat it as stable, but that does not erase the underlying play of difference. It simply means that in our day-to-day interactions, we bracket out that play, ignoring it. The significance of deconstruction is that it reveals this bracketing, showing that the illusions of finality and stability we hold in daily life are grounded in acts of exclusion, in the decision to not see the instability of signification. A hush fell over the crowd. For a moment, a sense of shared inquiry bound the audience, as though they had stepped onto a precarious ledge suspended between the possibility of certain meaning and the infinite abyss of interpretive flexibility. 9. The search for common ground. Despite the rhetorical flair, those who had come expecting a vicious intellectual slugfest might have been surprised to witness moments where Derrida and Searle nodded in understanding at each other's points. A sense of mutual respect permeated the debate, even as each man remained steadfast. At one point, Searle commented, "I do think Derrida has contributed to our understanding of how text can hide assumptions. I just don't believe that necessarily has the consequences he thinks it does for speech act theory or for the overall stability of language." In response, Derrida remarked, "And I do not deny that we communicate effectively most of the time. My goal is not to claim absolute breakdown of meaning, but to show the vulnerabilities, philosophically, ethically, and politically, of assuming that language is a transparent medium." A faint wave of laughter and applause swept through the hall, as observers realized this was likely as close to an accord as they were going to get. 10. A brief recess and private dialogue. A short intermission was called. The audience milled about, many clustering around the coffee station in the foyer. The line for restrooms wound down the corridor. Meanwhile, Derrida and Searle stood to the side of the stage, each sipping water. A handful of academics hovered at a polite distance, hoping to catch stray remarks. In a private moment, at least as private as one can get in a bustling auditorium, the two philosophers exchanged a few words away from the microphones. Searle offered Derrida a slight smile. "I think this has been productive," he ventured. "Even if we remain miles apart, there's something to be gained from clarifying the boundaries of our disagreement." Derrida nodded. "Yes, clarity can be beneficial, though I sometimes think that clarity can be a strategy to obscure the complexities." He gave a wry grin, letting Searle know he meant no offense. "But I do appreciate that you take the time to seriously engage. Not everyone in your tradition is so patient." Searle laughed softly, acknowledging the subtle jab. "I suppose the same is true from our side. Some of my colleagues think deconstruction is just a fancy way to say anything goes. So it helps to hear your nuanced view." They sipped their water in companionable silence for a few seconds, before the moderator signaled that the debate would soon resume. Each man steeled himself for the final session. 11. From deconstruction to politics, broader stakes. When the debate reconvened, the moderator introduced a new topic, the political implications of language. A hush fell over the auditorium again, as this was an area where Derrida's deconstructionist approach had stirred significant controversy. Accusations that deconstruction was either too radical or not radical enough, that it eroded the foundations needed for political action, or that it exposed the illusions propping up unjust hierarchies. "Professor Derrida," said the moderator, "you've written about the relationship between deconstruction and politics, suggesting that deconstruction might be the pathway to more responsible interpretations. Could you elaborate?" Derrida's voice grew earnest. Deconstruction is often misunderstood as a purely negative act, tearing down meaning, leaving only chaos. That's not my position. Deconstruction can allow us to see how political and ethical assumptions are encoded in language. For example, if a legal text or political speech privileges certain concepts, democracy, freedom, the people, we can ask how these words function, whose interests they serve, and which voices they marginalize. By revealing these hidden structures, we can open a space for more just interpretations, more inclusive policies. It's an ethical imperative to not take language at face value. Searle listened carefully. "I agree that analyzing assumptions is crucial," he said. "But I don't see how acknowledging the instability of meaning automatically translates to political or ethical responsibility. On the contrary, if every term can be deconstructed indefinitely, how do we ground any political principles? We need some shared understanding of terms like justice and equality if we're to enact them in the real world." Derrida shrugged lightly. "But do we not already see how terms like justice and equality are contested? Look at the debates in law and politics, endless arguments about what these words truly entail. Deconstruction does not prevent us from making claims about justice. It only reminds us that our interpretations must remain open, flexible, and vigilant. A claim to absolute certainty often leads to dogma, and dogma can become dangerous." Searle relented somewhat, conceding, "I'll grant that dogma is dangerous. Perhaps we differ in the emphasis we place on the necessity of stable ground. I don't believe absolute certainty is possible or desirable, but I do believe we can have sufficiently firm ground for coordinated action. Otherwise, democracy devolves into bickering about terms without any resolution." The moderator, sensing the conversation's philosophical richness, allowed it to continue. The audience was now fully immersed, drawn into the nuanced interplay of two worldviews that were at once conflicting and strangely complementary. 12. The role of the reader. An audience member, an older professor of English, rose to pose a question. "If meaning is indeterminate, how does the role of the reader or interpreter figure into all this? Do we all just interpret texts however we please, or is there some limitation?" Derrida replied, "It's a common misconception that deconstruction implies free rein for any interpretation. Instead, I suggest that we should read texts very closely, paying attention to their complexities. The text itself provides constraints, but those constraints are never absolute. The reading is an event that transforms both the text and the reader. Each reading reveals something new, but it's not arbitrary. It must be grounded in the text, even as it may subvert the author's presumed intention." Searle nodded. "Yes, we have constraints, linguistic conventions, cultural norms, the historical context of the author. My disagreement with Derrida is the extent to which these constraints remain robust. I believe they allow for a considerable measure of determinacy, at least enough to rule out wildly implausible interpretations. For example, if the text says the cat is on the mat, it's not about nuclear physics." A murmur of laughter drifted through the hall. Derrida smirked gently. "True, it is not about nuclear physics. Unless, of course, the context is a metaphorical text exploring quantum superposition," he said with a playful twinkle, drawing more laughter. 13. Closing statements. The hour grew late, and the moderator announced that each philosopher would offer a closing statement. An air of both anticipation and regret filled the auditorium. No one wanted this intellectual feast to end. Searle went first. "Thank you all for participating in this lively discussion. I want to emphasize that while I find many of Derrida's observations about reading and hidden assumptions compelling, I remain convinced that meaning and communication rely on shared conventions and intentions, enabling us to pass sincerity, fiction, or irony. Deconstruction might illuminate the complexities, but I believe those complexities do not negate the fundamental capacity for language to be a vehicle of reasonably stable meaning. Philosophical clarity, analytic rigor, these are the tools by which we can collectively refine our understanding, solve problems, and advance knowledge. I worry that without such rigor, we slip into a never-ending flux where no proposition can be definitively evaluated. He glanced over at Derrida, a faint look of respect crossing his features. Still, I appreciate the need to be vigilant, to question assumptions that might become invisible to us. In that sense, I do see a place for something like deconstruction, provided it doesn't deny the everyday fact that we do manage to communicate. Applause broke out. As it quieted, Derrida took his turn. I too am grateful for this exchange and for the careful attention everyone has given to our dialogue. Deconstruction is not about denying that we communicate. Rather, it insists on the careful reading of the structures that enable and limit communication, the differences, the deferrals, and the exclusions that language, culture, and tradition perpetuate. If we take these structures for granted, we risk overlooking how they shape our philosophies, our politics, and our ethics. Deconstruction, in my view, fosters a more responsible discourse by refusing the comfort of finality. It allows for an openness to the other, to new interpretations, to unexpected transformations. He cast a thoughtful glance at Searle. Where we disagree, I believe, is on the extent to which language is ever stable. But disagreement can be productive. It forces us to articulate our views more clearly, to examine where we might be too hasty. In that sense, I hope this debate has shown that the dialogue between analytic and continental traditions need not be a monologue of mutual dismissal, but can be a conversation that enriches us all. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing off the high ceilings of the old lecture hall. Many in the crowd rose to their feet, some crying out questions they hoped might still be addressed, others smiling broadly at the satisfaction of witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime intellectual encounter. 14. Aftermath, conversations in the halls. As the event concluded, students and professors spilled into the hallways, continuing the debate in smaller clusters. Some championed Searle's position, insisting that Derrida's emphasis on textual play was unhelpful in real-world contexts. Others praised Derrida, enthralled by the possibility of endless interpretative depth, the refusal to let language be pinned down by dogmatic rules. Marie and Ben, the two graduate students from earlier, now found themselves in a heated exchange. "See," Marie exclaimed, "Derrida doesn't deny we communicate. He just wants us to remember that communication is always partial, contingent, open to new contexts." Ben adjusted his glasses once more. "And Searle doesn't deny ambiguity. He just thinks we can't let that overshadow the real work of understanding intentions and conventions that guide meaning. They're not as far apart as everyone thinks." Marie nodded, thinking, maybe not, but they have different starting points. Derrida sees instability everywhere. Searle sees stability as the norm. Each is responding to different intellectual traditions. Ben tapped his chin. "You know, we might actually need both perspectives. Our world is too complex to rely on only one method of interpretation." Marie smiled. "I think that's exactly what Derrida meant by leaving things open." And so, the debate rippled outward, generating discussions that would inhabit classrooms, conferences, and journal pages for years to come. 15. A late-night reflection. That evening, Derrida wandered through the university's cloistered walkways, the moonlight casting geometric shadows along the Gothic arches. He was alone, having politely declined invitations to dinner gatherings. In the quiet of the night, he could not help but replay the day's debate in his mind, occasionally smirking at certain remarks, frowning at others. He knew that the clash between deconstruction and analytic philosophy was not a game of winners and losers. It was a crucible that tested the resilience and breadth of one's intellectual commitments. A part of him felt satisfied. He had articulated the central tenets of deconstruction to an audience steeped in the analytic tradition. showing them it was not the simplistic anything-goes approach some had caricatured. Another part of him felt that he had only grazed the surface of what deconstruction truly was, a continuous practice rather than a fixed doctrine. Nonetheless, he took solace in the hope that some had gleaned a new appreciation for the indeterminacy of language and the significance of reading carefully. Meanwhile, John Searle, sequestered in his hotel room near campus, paged through the notes he had prepared. He felt that the debate had been fair, though he privately wondered whether he could ever fully bridge the gap with someone who saw meaning as perpetually deferred. Reviewing his speech act frameworks, he reminded himself that his entire philosophical worldview hinged on the premise that we, as social beings, can indeed share a language and form institutions together. The notion of radical indeterminacy struck him as untenable, yet he also recognized a certain allure in Derrida's perspective. It was true that language could mislead us, that contexts shift, that the unspoken plays a role in shaping even the most straightforward utterances. Perhaps it would be worth refining his own theory to account more deeply for these hidden complexities. Neither man slept quickly that night, each lost in a labyrinth of words, contexts, and possibilities. 16. Echoes in the academic world. In the weeks that followed, transcripts of the debate circulated among academics far and wide. Some heralded the event as a groundbreaking moment of rapprochement between continental and analytic philosophy. Others dismissed it as inconclusive posturing. Scholarly journals published follow-up articles, with participants offering expansions and criticisms. New conferences were proposed, some focusing on bridging or at least clarifying the differences between these two major philosophical lineages. Graduate students across the world dissected the transcript in seminars. Some argued that Searle had won by demonstrating how meaning can remain stable enough for practical purposes. Others claimed Derrida had revealed the deeper illusions of stable meaning. Still others saw the debate as evidence that philosophy, at its best, thrives on perpetual dialogue rather than final consensus. Derrida went on to deliver a new series of lectures in which he revisited themes from the debate, speaking more explicitly about the role of iterability in political discourse. Searle, for his part, incorporated new sections into his seminars on speech acts, addressing the possibility of radical context shifts. He continued to assert that while language may be flexible, it is not infinitely so. The conversation lived on, shifting over time into new areas: the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, literary theory, post-colonial studies, ethics. Everywhere it traveled, the spectre of the Derrida-Searle debate emerged, as though it had become a kind of philosophical archetype. The tension between the play of language and the quest for clarity, between deconstruction and reconstruction, between unmasking illusions and forging workable truths. 17. A return to the present. Decades later, scholars still recall that autumn day at the University of Chicago. Some of the audience members, now venerable professors themselves, recount how they witnessed a rare meeting between two giants, each articulating a vision of language that would shape scholarship for generations. They speak of the hush that fell over the crowd, as Derrida described difference, and the ripple of agreement when Searle insisted that intentions and conventions give words their force. They remember the polite laughter at the mention of the cat on the mat, and the sudden hush when politics came up. In time, both Jacques Derrida and John Searle left their marks on the intellectual landscape, though Derrida's passing in 2004 gave his legacy a sort of timeless aura, while Searle continued to engage with new debates, until controversies of his own later in life overshadowed some of his philosophical contributions. Yet the core of their exchange remains a turning point: the day they stood face to face, bridging, if only momentarily, two worlds that had often spoken past one another. 18. Conclusion: a story with no final word. And so, the story of Jacques Derrida and John Searle on deconstruction and language does not end neatly. It is, by its very nature, open-ended, just as Derrida would have it. One might say the debate continues to resonate wherever thinkers grapple with how words mean, how context shifts, how interpretation can liberate or constrain us. For some, Searle's arguments affirm the necessity of stable ground, of shared rules and intentions without which society itself could not function. For others, Derrida's deconstruction remains a clarion call to scrutinize the foundations, to not be lulled by the comforting illusion of final clarity. In that sense, the debate itself is an event of iterability, cited, recontextualized, repeated in new settings and new discourses. Each iteration transforms it, adding layers of meaning or uncovering neglected aspects. One might say that the debate is, in Derrida's sense, forever deferred, an endless signifier that carries forward the irreconcilable tension between the desire for certainty and the recognition of infinite complexity. Still, one thing remains clear. That afternoon in Chicago left no one untouched. The two men who took their seats at that long oak table each stood for a different tradition, a different temperament, a different faith in what language could do. Yet they spoke, they listened, they argued, and in so doing, they manifested the power of words to both divide and unite. Their exchange became a testament to the fragile, wondrous possibility that we can understand one another, or at least approximate understanding, even when the very tools of our discourse are suspect.